Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman. We're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help people improve their chess game. In today's video, we're going to do another amateur game. If you missed any of our other amateur games, that's kind of a shame. I always tell people you want to go over both master and amateur games. If you want to go over a lot more master games than amateur games, that's understandable. You want to see what good play looks like, what you should do in certain types of situations. That's all very good, but going over some amateur games also is very helpful because amateurs make the same kind of mistakes that most of my viewers make, and you want to make sure that when you make those mistakes, you know how to take advantage of them and also how to avoid them. So in going over amateur games, you get a chance to see what to do about those mistakes from both sides. All right, and most of the games we go over are not beginner games, they're amateur games. Amateur means below 2200. Most of the games, in fact, all the ones, hopefully, that I pick out are fairly well played. You're not going to say... I had one time someone said to me, I don't want to go over amateur games. I don't want to see someone putting their queen on prees. That's not an amateur game. That's a beginner game. Beginner games, not as important. So, amateur games, below 2200. Let's go. White and black in this amateur game. White opens up b3. Perfectly reasonable Queen's Fianchetto kind of opening, can transpose into a lot of things, especially if things reversed. Black plays the very flexible knight f6. White plays bishop b2, d5. We sort of have a kind of either a Nimzo Indian kind of reversed or a Queen's Indian reversed, depending on what black does here. c5 looking more and more maybe like a Queen's Indian reversed. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. Yep, there we go, Queen's Indian reversed, where white has an extra tempo. All right, so black plays bishop d7. When I first started playing, I thought moves like bishop d7 were not very good. You know, I thought that the knight's already guarded by a pawn. If he doubles the pawns, you get the semi-open file on the bishop pair. You know, why guard the knight again with the bishop? But when I go over the games with the computer says, yeah, it's not so bad. For instance, here, it gives bishop d7 as black's best move. And you could argue that's to avoid the doubled pawns. You could argue it's to avoid pressure with knight to e5. However you want to put it, the passive-looking move bishop d7 is perfectly acceptable in these kind of positions. Okay, so bishop d7, white castles. Black says, all right, Mr. Bishop, either go away or give me the bishop pair. Computer suggests white should give up the bishop pair and play bishop takes c6. White plays bishop back to e2. Stockfish 10 says the game's about equal. Says black should play rook c8. Black plays e6. Computer now likes c4 for white with a slight, well, I shouldn't even say slight advantage, 0.7 advantage for white. d4 instead. As I just said, the engine said that's not quite as good. Back to equal. Pawn takes, interesting move. And now how should white take? Normally in positions like this, you want your one pawn holding up the two central pawns. And this is no exception. The best way to take back here is to take with the pawn. Later on, maybe you can stick a knight on e5 that's supported also by the bishop on b2. And this is probably a little bit better than the other captures. White captures with the knight. And now his pawn on e3 is not as centrally controlling as the one on d4. Now, it's true the bishop has the open diagonal, but that's not as big an issue right here. Okay, bishop d6 here, best move. He plays it. White should play his break move, c4, to break up the pawns in the center. White plays knight c3, blocking his break move. So that's a little bit of a positional mistake. The knight is perfectly good on c3, but now black's center is really controlling the position. If white had played c4 to try to break up those pawns, then black's center won't be as imposing. And with the knight on c3, white can't do that. Notice he can't play e4 on the next move either because black's got 2 on it, white's only got 1. Okay, so black castles. White plays queen d2. White's a little bit cramped thanks to the fact that the pawn is not on d4 and the knight's on c3 again. So black has a nice advantage. Black plays his number one move, rook to c8, puts the rook on the semi-open file with pressure. In some lines, black can even play bishop to b4 And that knight on c3, which is not guarded by a pawn and could be pinned to the queen, could create some dangerous tactics. So here, Stockfish 10 suggests that white should play a3 to avoid all that kind of funny business. Tactics don't just happen. Tactics happen when you either make bad moves that set them up, or you don't make preventative moves that let them happen. And here, white's setting himself up for some problems if he doesn't play a move like a3 soon, or maybe move the queen out of the way. So white does play a3, good for white. And black plays queen c7, trying to put more pressure on that knight in the semi-open file with the pawn. White plays the strange move h3. Not so strange because he was threatening bishop takes. Let's see. Stockfish says the best way to stop bishop takes h3 is to play f4. The second best way is to play h3. All right, so not so strange. Certainly understandable. All right, so h3, b5. Okay, black's expanding on the queen side. Black still has an advantage of about 2/3 of a pawn. Now white needs to figure out how to untangle his pieces here. The engine suggests the best way to do that is to play bishop d3. White plays rook f d1. And now black's starting to get close to playing b4 and recapturing with the bishop because of all the pressure on the c-file. The engine thinks that the right way to do that is take the knight first. Now, if white plays queen takes, black has bishop e5 hitting the knight a third time, winning a piece. And if white plays pawn takes, black can hit the knight with the pawn. If white takes and black takes back, he can't guard the knight. But if he moves the knight here, let's say he plays knight to a4, then black has all kinds of good moves here. He could first play knight e4. When the queen goes somewhere, let's say the queen goes to, I don't know, e1, bishop takes a4, b takes a4, queen takes c2, and white's game's falling apart. So knight takes d4 is pretty much winning here. Black plays b4 right away, which is also good, not quite as accurate. One of the reasons why it's not quite as good is he's setting up a counting sequence where black's going to be threatening to win a piece, but white's going to get a pawn and the exchange. And therefore, the possibilities in this position are a little bit more unclear. When you get to a position like this, let's play one more move. White decided not to just give him the pawn, and he took the pawn, allowing black to pin the knight. And now black on purpose is going to give up this pawn with the idea of trying to win a piece. So white plays bishop takes a6. So when black does this, when black plays b4, he's initiating what I've called in my book Back to Basics Tactics a counting sequence. I actually named it that first in my Novice Nook column. I had someone watch my earlier video on the counting tactic, and he chastised me and he said, "You're just making up names. This is just pure analysis. There's no such thing as, a counting tactic." Well, he's definitely wrong. Any tactic, when you're looking at it, is under analysis. Analysis and tactic are not mutually exclusive. You analyze things to see if they are tactics. So, for instance, suppose you have a pin. Well, if you analyze the pin and it turns out you win material, that pin becomes a tactic under your analysis. But suppose you have a pin and you analyze it and it turns out that pin just restricts that piece that you're pinning, but you're not actually winning any material. Well, then it's not a tactic. In either case, it's analysis. In one case, the pin is a tactic. In the other case, it's not. Well, counting is exactly the same. You're doing analysis. Of course, he was right to call it analysis. But what are you analyzing? You're analyzing for a potential tactic. The question is, what do you call the tactic if it wins material? Well, you can't call it a double attack or a pin or this or that. The tactic needs a name. And I asked Dr. John Nunn what I should call that tactic. I wrote him an email and I said, in your book you have certain problems that you called miscellaneous. I'd like to give them a name. I'd like to call it tactic. And Dr. Nunn, Grandmaster Nunn, said, Well, that's as good a name as any. And this is a good example here. Black is going to, on purpose, give up this pawn and possibly the exchange with the idea of winning the knight on c3. And when the smoke clears, he's going to end up ahead in material. And if you ask, well, how did he do it? What tactic did he pull on white? The answer is, well, initially it was a pin, but now he's done a pin, he's got to also do something on top of the pin because his rook is attacked. If he just moves the rook, he's not going to win the material. So what Black does is he plays knight takes d4, removing the knight from the board before the knight can guard the other knight. So he's initiating basically a tactic based on this pin. If you want to call it a pinning tactic here, you're certainly welcome to do that. But it's also a counting tactic because he's got to give up the exchange. And when the smoke clears, he's going to figure out whether he's ahead or not. So white takes with the queen. If white takes with the pawn, of course, black can simply play bishop takes c3 right away, or he can play knight e4 first, followed by bishop takes or knight takes c3. White takes with the queen. And black says, go ahead and take my rook. And he plays bishop takes c3. Of course, white can't take the rook now. He's got his queen attacked. So white plays bishop takes c3. And now black has... This isn't exactly the end of the counting tactic in the sense that black is now already, one way or another, he's going to give up the rook for the bishop because he wants to take the bishop. The question is, does he want to attack the queen first with a move like e5 and then take the bishop? Or does he want to take the bishop first? And Stockfish says it doesn't make much difference. So here, you're not going to move the rook and not take the bishop. You want to win 2 bishops for the rook. Again, that's just counting. So black correctly decides not to move the rook, plays queen takes c3. And now white has to decide, does he want to play bishop takes c8 or not? And of course he has to, because if he plays queen takes c3, the rook that's under attack will take the queen, and then he won't even get the exchange. So white's move is absolutely forced. He has to play bishop c8, and now black has a choice again. Everybody's been getting all these choices in these captures, and these are the moves you want to play really slow and make sure you get right. Do you want to take with the queen and have 2 pieces versus a rook and a pawn with the queens on the board? Or do you want to take with the rook and give white the opportunity of trading queens and going to the endgame with a rook and pawn against the 2 pieces? Generally, the pawns and the rooks get better in the endgame, so if you're going to be down a rook and a pawn versus 2 pieces, when I say down, if you use the Reinfeld values, it's 6-6. But if you use more sophisticated values, a rook and a pawn is worth less than 2 pieces. Right here, Stockfish says that black's going to be up about a pawn no matter what he plays, whether he plays rook takes c8 or queen takes c8. So you have to figure out what you want to do. And here, black's turns out to be a little bit better to keep the queens on the board with the 2 pieces for the pawn. Normally when you're ahead, you want to trade down, so that would tell you to take with the rook. Here, because of the power of the rooks and the pawns in the endgame, it's a little bit better to take with the queen. So black plays rook takes, and the computer says that black's advantage, which was about a pawn, dropped a few tenths here. Okay, so the smoke finally clears, and black takes, but of course we have to watch out for the back rank, and that black can cope with. He's got a knight and a bishop guarding the e8 square. White says, which way are you going to block it? And here's one of the key moments of the game. If you don't understand why, maybe take a little time here and figure out which move are you going to play. You've got rook c8, bishop c8, bishop e8, or knight e8. Those are your 4 moves. Turns out some are a lot better than the others. Well, what black should do is probably blockade with the bishop. If he blockades with the bishop, the piece that's going to guard it is going to be perfectly safe, and then the king can get out of the pin. He has several ways of doing that. He can play f8 to e7. He might even be able to play g6 and king g7 and then move the bishop. Black instead must have played this move a little bit fast because he plays the worst move he could play to get out of check, and that's knight e8. And now white takes advantage of that and turns the whole game around with the tactic e4. Why is it a tactic? Because he's hitting the d5 pawn twice, and the pawn on d5 can't take on e4 because if he takes on e4, then rook takes d7. but he can't easily guard it either. For instance, suppose he plays bishop c6. Then white's going to pin that bishop with rook c8 and threaten to take the pawn. And just bad things are happening to the black position here. If black, on the other hand, guards the pawn with rook here, white can play something like pawn takes, and then rook d8 hitting the bishop. If the bishop goes up to b5, white can remove the guard with b4. If the bishop goes to c6, white can just hit the knight again with rook e1, and on king f8, he can play rook c8, pin the bishop, and again, bad things are happening. So black's in trouble here no matter what he does. What black decides to do is play king f8, giving up the pawn, and Stockfish says that's the best move he's got. He's got to give up the pawn. But that was an important pawn that he was ahead. So white says thanks for the pawn. And now black needs to just play king to e7. White's not threatening to win another pawn. Black needs to get out of the pin and get his pieces rolling, and the game should end in a draw if he does that. Instead, after e takes d5, black makes a pretty big mistake. He plays e5. And now the problem is white has removal of the guard possibilities. What white should do here is play d6, keeping the king out of e7 and in the pin. And then he's going to be threatening to play something like rook to d8. For instance, suppose black plays rook takes c2, rook to d8, and now no matter, he can't guard the bishop, he can't guard it with the king, there's no legal move, he can't guard it with the rook, the pawn's guarding the square, and if the bishop moves somewhere, simply d7, hitting the pinned knight with the pawn, and bye-bye black. So all white has to do to win the game is play d6. There's no defense against rook to d8. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. There's no defense against rook to d8. Instead, white misses his chance. He plays rook d2. He thinks that he needs to guard this pawn first. But of course, the threats for d6 are so strong that he'd be happy to give up that pawn on c2. This gives black the time he needs to get back in the game and play king e7. So now, Stockfish says after all that plus and minus going back and forth, the game's back to 0-0-0. So with best play, this should be a draw. So both sides have missed winning ideas here. Black initially had a big advantage winning the two pieces for the rook and the pawn. Then he blocked the check with the wrong move with the knight. Then he made another bad move. White had a chance to play d6, and unfortunately for white, he missed that. And now we're back into a pretty equal endgame. Okay, so knight d6. White's going to get his king into the game, king to e1. He wants to bring his king up to b2, harass the rook, and maybe get his three connected passed pawns rolling. Black would like to stop that. Black plays knight to b5. White plays rook a4. Black moves his knight back to d6. Didn't have to do that, but it's okay. White says, would you like a draw? I don't feel quite right here. Black could still play knight b5, and then with the idea later of maybe playing king d6 here. Black plays f6, which is a mistake. So what black needs is a tempo. What he needs is the tempo to get his king out of the pin and bring his bishop to f5. So for instance, knight b5, king e1, knight d4. If king c1, well, he can't play king c1 because of knight b3 check. So let's say here black plays, okay. Bad analysis. I should first save the rook. I went through this with the computer and I wasn't looking at his analysis. All right, so knight to b5. White saves the rook. King to d6. King to d1. Knight to d4. Now he can play king to c1 because knight takes b3 as check is not a move. And now black has the opportunity to play bishop f5, hitting this pawn a third time, and it can't be guarded the third time. And after king b2, rook takes c2 check with an equal game. If white instead blunders and plays rook takes f7, then bishop takes c2 gives black a better game, because if king to b2 now, black has rook takes b3 check. Okay, so that was the right move order. The right move order for black was to, instead of play f6, attack the rook. When he saves the rook, which gives you that extra tempo, get the king out of the pin, get the knight to d4, get the bishop to f5, hit this pawn 3 times while it's blockaded, and you can get your draw. Instead, black plays f6 first, which doesn't really fit in to the system. There is our f6. And white now gets his king up to b2 without black having time to get the bishop to b5. So he plays knight f5, which is actually a little bit less accurate than knight b5 because he's not hitting the rook, the one that I left on pre's a move or so ago. Okay, so king to c1, knight to d4, king to b2, and notice no bishop f5, it's pinned. Black lost that crucial tempo from what we looked at before. And now black's in trouble because the king has gotten to the square he wants to. The rook can't maintain the blockade. For instance, right now, suppose black plays something like knight to b5. Well, because the knight is tied down guarding the rook, white can start with check, and knight takes d6 is not possible due to king takes c3. And if black plays king e6 here, white has something like rook takes, king takes, rook d5, removal of the guard. If the knight moves, the king takes the rook. But if the rook moves, the rook takes the knight. So white's actually just winning here. Cute line. All right, so black instead just brings his rook back. And white says, oh, thank goodness, now I get to finally move that pawn that's been sitting there on c2 for a while. That was not a backward pawn. You know, a backward pawn is one that's hindered by opposing pawns. It was a blockaded passed pawn, not a backward pawn. Okay, so now it's an unblockaded passed pawn, and it's part of a very, very powerful, connected passed pawn 3-on-0 wing on the queen side for white, which should win him the game with proper play. Black gets out of the pin, white checks, black comes up, white brings his king up, and now he's threatening b4 checkmate. Obviously, black's going to see that. He plays knight checks, says, sneaky pin, if you take my knight, I will take discovered check, and if you put your rook in the way, I can take it off and be okay. So white says, yeah, I see that. And he plays king back to b2, and he says, I'll try something else. And black says, good, would you like a draw? You can bring your king up to c3 again, and we can agree to a draw. White says, no, I don't think so. That didn't work. I'll try something else. So he plays rook a7, skewering the bishop to the g7 pawn. Black guards the bishop. And white plays f4, a break move. Why is it a break move? Because it's a pawn attacking a fixed pawn. Why is it a fixed pawn? Because if it moves up, white will win the knight. So white's using that move to break up the black pawns. Black says, all right, let me hit that pawn on b3. White guards it with rook a3, a little bit passive. The computer likes c5 check first, or maybe even f takes e5, and then c5, with the idea, of course, that if the king ever takes on c5, that's removal of the guard of the bishop on d7. All right, so rook a3, white's playing conservative, but he has a great position. Knight f5, king back up to c3, getting ready to push the pawns again. If black wants, he can take the pawn. The computer says here that king c3 is a mistake, not because he's losing the pawn, but because of another move. It says the best thing to do is trade off the pawns first, and then maybe play rook a6 check. The problem with king c3 is not that he's losing the pawn, although that's black's second best move. It's that black can play knight g3 first, threatening to fork him, and then take the pawn. And it says black is getting back in the game here. And to black's credit, he sees that knight g3 is the best move. And now white should probably either take the pawn or maybe give a check first. He takes the pawn, and now black should take with the king. Taking with the king is much better than taking with the pawn. If he takes with the king, there's no checks. He's still threatening the fork. There's no checks over here. If white tries to get out of this, let's say white plays a move like, I don't know, king to c2 to stop the fork. Black can play bishop f5 check, king to b2, And white's still better, but it's more of a game than it was before. The black pieces are getting active. Instead, black takes with the pawn. Well, that gives him a passed pawn, but it also keeps his king vulnerable. And white takes advantage of that with a check. And again, the king can't come up because, well, he could come up with a check. If he comes up to c5, then the best way for white to play this is check him again. If he tries to repeat the position, then play c5 check. And here, obviously, if he plays king to, well, if he plays king to b6, then white can double his rooks on the a file with some threats. All right, so black does end up going back to b6, and white plays the right move, rook on d to a2, threatening not only some checks that are awkward, but also possibly trading off the rooks, which would mean the bishop and the knight can't really fight against the king, the three connected passed pawns, and the rook. Black tries to get his knight back in the game with a check. White plays king c2. It's nice to go diagonal from the knight, although you do have to watch out for bishop attacks. Black says, I have nothing better than to try to do that. White says, okay, I have a bunch of checks here. He checks the rook. He skewers the rook on b8. Black has to guard that rook. He checks on a7. The king continues to have to guard the rook with king c8. He trades with check. And now he says, can that knight do anything to me? Are there any good squares? If I just take that pawn, can he attack my rook? The answer is no, 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 and no. So he takes the pawn. Good move. Black says, darn, I don't have any good discoveries here. Things are starting to look pretty bad. He plays knight to c5 check. White brings his king up. If he checks him again, he can continue to bring the king up. So he brings the knight back. The problem with that is the knight is guarded by the bishop, and the bishop doesn't have much of a diagonal. So white simply says, Mr. Bishop, where are you going to go? If you go to e6, I'll take you with the pawn. If you go to g4, I'll take you with the pawn. If you go to h3, I'll take you with the pawn. If you go to any other move off of that diagonal, I'll take the knight. You have no knight move to guard the bishop, so you have no good checks. If you move the knight, I can take the bishop, and you can't fork my king and my rook on f5, so I'm just winning a piece. Black says, yes, you are. I resign. Okay, so interesting game. We had both sides go back and forth. Both sides did some really good moves. Both sides had a few bad moves. Both sides had some winning chances. It was not a one-way game. Both sides had chances to win. Black had the initial good idea of giving up the rook and the pawn for the two pieces. He was doing great till he unfortunately pinned his knight the wrong way. Then after that, white was back in the game. Then black blundered. White had a chance to win with d6. He missed it. Black was back equal. But then he made that f6 move, which didn't look bad, but actually lost the tempo. And that allowed white to unblockade that pawn on c2, that powerful passed pawn on c2. And once he was able to unblockade it, the rest of the game was pretty much according to script. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed it. For Dan Heisman, that's me. These are our amateur games in our video series. We'll see you next time. By the way, I'm giving out a free lesson to one of my 1,000 subscribers when I get to 1,000. Right now I'm at 950 or so. So if you enjoy the videos, you can subscribe. If you haven't told a friend of yours, tell a friend. Maybe he'll get me up to 1,000, and maybe somebody will win that free lesson. Okay, thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you next time. Bye.